Hi, I am Alex and I am going to be your tutor. So, one of the first questions, let's just dive right in, is how many schools should you be applying to? So, for example, I often have students who apply to 20 plus schools, then there are other students who only apply to a few schools because they're really sure of where they want to go. So, to answer that question, if you have a specific interest, let's say you're really passionate about engineering, then you definitely want to apply to MIT, Stanford, schools like that. And if you're really interested in business, then maybe you want to apply to UPenn early. So if you have a very specific interest, then it may be best to limit your schools based on that. So for example, when I was applying to colleges, I knew I was going to study engineering. So my thought process was, okay, I'm going to apply to MIT and Stanford, and if not, then I'll end up going to a state school and save some money. And that allowed me to have a lot more time to focus on my MIT and my Stanford essays because I was only applying to two schools. So, my advice to everyone is if you are going to apply to a lot of schools, which I completely understand, make sure that you begin the essay writing process as early as possible, right? If you're applying to 20 schools and you want to write really good essays for each school, then you need to be planning months and months in advance. And that's kind of the best advice for how many schools you should apply to. One of the next questions that I get a lot is, should I be applying early to schools? And the answer to that question is yes. If you have a school you know you want to go to, whether it's Brown, UPenn, Stanford, Harvard, whatever it is, you should be applying early, at least somewhere. So, for example, Duke, which has early decision, which means if you're accepted in the early decision phase, when the applications come back in about December and you get accepted, you're required to go to Duke University. So you're taking a little bit of a gamble because you're locked into going to Duke if you get in. However, the acceptance rate for applying early to Duke ED, early decision, is 21%, which is crazy because the average acceptance rate at Duke is about 8%, right? And the same goes for Harvard. They're restricted early action. The average acceptance rate is about 14.5% compared to their typical acceptance rate overall of about 4.6%. Thus, I highly recommend that you apply early to at least one school. If you're set on a particular college, see if it has early decision, such as Duke has. And if you're not set on a particular college, then you can still apply restricted early. Like Stanford has restricted early, Harvard has restricted early. That just means you can only apply to one school early and possibly your state university. Okay, so my best advice, you definitely want to be applying early, at least somewhere. So the next thing we're going to talk about is your coursework. And this should go without saying, but you want your grades to be as high as possible, right? Extracurriculars, essays, standardized test scores, that's all extremely important in the college admissions process, but you still need your grades to be above a certain threshold. For example, if you have a 3.2 GPA, it's going to be nearly impossible to get into Stanford, Harvard, Yale, and schools like that. Thus, you should try to have, above a 3.7 GPA if you want to be competitive for these types of schools. Now, oftentimes people ask me, oh, I have a 3.85 GPA, should I round it up to a 3.9 GPA, questions like that. But the answer really doesn't matter that much. If you have a 3.8, 3.9, 3.95, it really won't make or break your application. You just want your grades to be as good as possible. Okay? So just try to get your GPA as high as possible, try to definitely have above a 3.7, and then don't worry about grades too much, right? GPA is typically used as a cutoff to weed out candidates, and you really don't need to focus on taking unlimited AP courses and having a 4.8 GPA, right? That's not the most important thing in the college admissions process. So one thing people oftentimes ask me is which specific courses should I take in college? And to answer that question, we kind of need to dive into the type of student you are. So for example, if you're going to be applying to Stanford as an engineer, then my advice to you would be take as many math and science courses as possible. So yes, you should be taking AP Physics, AP Chemistry, AP Biology if you plan to apply as an engineer. If your high school has them, take the hardest possible math and science courses. However, you don't need to take honors English, AP language, AP Spanish, things like that. If you're an engineer, what you should be doing is taking as many hard math and science courses as possible, getting an A in them, taking regular English, regular Spanish, getting that done, getting an A in those courses, and then spending the majority of your free time doing something unique that'll make you stand out in the extracurricular section. Okay? So no, you don't need to take AP Spanish, AP French, and AP English your senior year to stand out to colleges if you're applying as an engineering student. In fact, I'd advise, it's much better that you spend that time preparing for, let's say, the U.S. Computing Olympiad or the U.S. Biology Olympiad and scoring extremely well in that, as colleges would be more impressed by that. Okay? And the same goes if, let's say, you're a writing student. If you're a writing student, you don't have to stress about taking AP Physics, things like that. Instead, you should take AP Lang, AP Lit, classes related to writing, and do as well as possible in them. Make your teachers love you in those subjects. And then spend time outside of the classroom. Instead of taking AP Physics, take regular physics. And then spend that extra time writing your own book, writing for the school newspaper, or doing something that really gets across to the schools your passion in writing. So to go over everything again, you really want your grades as high as possible, but don't feel that you have to take courses that are not related to what you're actually interested in studying. To get into top colleges, you want to have one clear passion and be really, really, really good at it. So if you're an engineer, take all the hard engineering courses and then dedicate the rest of your time to doing interesting extracurricular activities in engineering. And if you're a writer, the same goes for writing. Take all the hard English classes, and then outside the classroom, do things that are very interesting, in writing. Publish your own book, whatever it is. Okay, so now let's talk about standardized tests. So one of the first questions I always get, should I take the SAT or the ACT? Now my general advice is, it really doesn't matter, but if you're better at math and science, take the ACT, and if you're better at English, take the SAT. That's one very general piece of advice. Or another piece of advice is just take both and pick whichever score is higher. Okay, now as you can see on the slide, the average Ivy League ACT score is about a 33, and the average Ivy League SAT is about a 1530. Thus, my advice to most students is aim for those scores. Obviously, you want your scores as high as possible, but if they're a tad lower or a bit higher, that's great if they're higher, and if they're a bit lower, maybe you retake them, but it's not the end of the world. So for example, if you have a 26 ACT score, then your odds of getting into Harvard, Stanford, schools like that are almost nothing. However, don't worry if you have a 32 versus a 33 or a 33 versus a 34. It really won't make or break your application. Just focus on trying to get about the average and then don't take it again. If you have a 34 ACT, you don't have to take it again and try to get a 36. It really doesn't matter. As I said with GPA, oftentimes these standardized test scores are simply used to weed out applicants. So once you hit a certain threshold, whether it's 32, 33, I would not worry about taking it again. Okay, same goes for subject tests. Just try to get your score as high as possible, then move on. You want to spend much more time thinking about your extracurricular activities and how you're going to stand out in the application process. Since you have a pretty good score, just move on. Okay, next is teacher recommendations. So, again, let's just simplify this. As I said before, when you're applying to schools, it's really important that you have something you're really good at. You don't want to do every possible extracurricular activity. What you really want to do is have something and be really good at it. So for example, maybe you're a student passionate about math and science and you want to study engineering. Then you should be in engineering clubs at your school. You could tutor young students in math and science. There are a bunch of things you could do to show the college admissions committees that you are passionate about engineering. And the same goes for your recommendations. If you're really passionate about math and science and studying engineering, you should make sure that your math and science teachers really love you, they know how talented you are, and they'd be there to write recommendations for you. And I think it would be best if you asked those teachers for your recommendations. The same goes if you're a writer. If you're really passionate about writing, make sure that your English teachers write your recommendations, and also make sure that you really try hard in those courses and show your teachers that you're a passionate, talented student who deserves to go to the Ivy League. Okay, next we have extracurricular activities. And I think this is by far the most important and most difficult part of the college admissions process, especially for elite universities. So, first, I want to dispel the notion that you need to do everything. You don't need to volunteer and start your own club and write for your school's newspaper. You don't need to do everything. You really don't. As I said earlier, when you're applying to colleges, you need to stand out. What colleges want is for you to be the best at something. Okay? So if you're an engineer, they want to know that you're one of the best, most talented engineers that they could accept. If you're a writer, they want to know that you're one of the most talented, driven, best writers that they could accept. So your extracurriculars, like your letters of recommendation, really should be tailored to your narrative and what you're good at. So for example, if you're applying as an engineer, you could start your own iPhone app. You should compete in Intel Science Talent Search. Your school's science fair, you could write your own software app. You could compete in, the US Biology Olympiad. There are a bunch of things you could do to show you're unique, but you don't necessarily, it's unnecessary to do all these volunteer hours and start your own writing club and join student council if that's not part of your narrative. So if you're an engineer, you're applying as an engineer, dedicate your time to showing you're the best possible engineer. Compete in different Olympiads, write in science journals, do things like that. On the contrary, if you're a writer and you're applying as a writer, you obviously don't need to join your school's economics or biology club. Instead, maybe you could write your own book. You could start your own blog and grow the business. There are a bunch of things you could do. So most importantly, have extracurricular activities that show you are a unique, one-of-a-kind student who is really, really good at one thing. It's really important that you want to be extremely talented in one thing. You want to be very talented in one thing as opposed to okay at a bunch of things. For example, Harvard in a heartbeat would accept a student who won UASCO, the United States American Computing Olympiad, I believe it is, and developed their own iOS app over a student who, joined the biology club, wrote for the school's newspaper, etc. You want to be really, really good at one thing, and your extracurricular activity should show that. Okay, so now the last step before we get to editing, your individual essays is how should you write an essay? So one thing to dispel is you need to use fancy language, big words in your college essays. You don't. What you really need to do is just get your ideas across clearly and show that you're a talented student who deserves a spot at the university. So for example, if you're an engineer and you're applying as an engineering student and your extracurricular activities are related to engineering, maybe in your essay you could write about how you're passionate about engineering, or a time you decided on some idea you wanted to pursue, or some business you wanted to pursue, some software you wanted to build. Those are all great ideas, and then all you need to do is get your ideas across in a clear way that shows the admissions committee you're a driven, passionate engineer. Okay? Another thing is you need to remember that every single essay you are trying to sell yourself. These are persuasive essays. You are trying to convince the admissions committees to let you into the school, to admit you. Thus, every single essay, you need to look at that essay, step back and think, okay, after the admissions officer reads this, will he or she have a higher probability of letting me into the school? If the answer is yes, you wrote a good essay. If the answer is no, then you need to redo something. Okay? Every single essay is a pitch to the university on why they should accept you.